What is important is to understand what are the ethical issues in publication, and when you publish yourself, to be aware of the fact that there are issues. You need to be sure of these, remain away from any controversy as far as these are concerned. Okay. Now, if I was there standing in front of you, I would ask you to read through the slide. I would stand there silently and at the end of a few minutes ask you, what do you think about this? Today, I'm not going to get a response from you. So therefore, I will read through this and say that a senior clinician was requested to write a chapter for a new book. He had written an original article on the subject recently, a couple of years back, and he felt that the information that he had was up to date there. Since the book and the article were totally in different formats and for different audiences, he reproduced the text, the tables, and the diagrams from his published paper in his chapter. Now, the published paper was a review which he had been asked to write, which was based on the original work that he'd done on the subject. So obviously, he was an authority on the subject, and that's why he was being asked to write a chapter for a new book. So now a lot of people would say, well, that's fine. That's his own chapter, his own publication, his own original article, his own review article. From there, he's gone on to write his own chapter. Even if he's reproduced the text tables and the diagrams, what is the problem? Well, there is a problem. There is a problem if he doesn't tell people that he's doing this. If he tells people he's doing it, then that's fine. And if for the publisher, there is no issue, there are no copyright issues involved, and we'll talk about all these as we go along, then it's all fine. But if he doesn't declare this, if he's not transparent about this, then there is an issue. So the issues largely which relate to publication ethics revolve around being transparent, being honest, and telling people very clearly what exactly you're doing. You can't presume that what you're doing, everybody knows what you're doing. No, they don't know. They're presuming you're not doing a few things. So therefore, you must tell people exactly what you're doing. So what is scientific misconduct, which is part and parcel of the issue of publication ethics? Behaviors or actions that do not conform to ethical standards in conducting research and publishing research constitute scientific misconduct. So my brief is to talk about publishing, not about conducting research. So I'm not going to focus on the areas which relate specifically to the actual performance of the research. Okay? So trial design, trial study, trial registration, all these are issues that I will not touch upon. Now, does publication misconduct occur? So in 1974, there was a gentleman by the name of Summerlin, an immunologist, who was doing some experiments. He was trying to transplant some skin of black mice onto white mice, or the other way around, something, I forget what. But he ended up with a failed experiment. But what he needed was a successful experiment to be able to get a further grant for himself. Now, there are various types of stories going around, but essentially what he did was that he falsified some pictures that he had, used a sketch pen to draw a patch of black on the white mouse, the picture of the white mouse, and showed it to the grant giving agency or the committee giving the grant, extending his grant. And he was caught out, unfortunately. Because he was caught out, he obviously didn't get the grant. More importantly, people came to know about it. And even today, so many years later, people like me who talk about publication ethics or teach publication ethics quote him as an example of things that you should not do. In 1994, the US Congress, almost 2 decades later, set up a group to look at how many instances of scientific misconduct had occurred. And at that time, documented evidence of 57 such instances was available to the US Congress, available of instances within the US. This has obviously increased manifold over the years. Now, we don't know exactly what is the number, but it's probably in thousands and hundreds of thousands if you look at the instances of scientific misconduct. So instead of looking at what were these, what are the actual numbers there, the numbers are huge. We look at some of the interesting instances where this has happened. Discovery of streptomycin won the Nobel Prize in 1952. But Albert Schatz and Selman Waksman, teacher-student, had a debate over who should have actually got the Nobel Prize, the student or the person whose lab, under whose instruction, the mentor under whom the person was working. And there was this huge controversy about whether the student at least should have been acknowledged and so on and so forth. John Darcy was a person working under Eugene Grunwald, and all of us have heard of Eugene Grunwald. I hope you all have heard of him. He used to be the editor-in-chief of Harrison's Principles of Internal Medicine, the textbook of internal medicine that everybody reads. And for years together, he was, along with Albert Fauci, he was one of the editors. He was the editor-in-chief while the others were editors or co-editors. So John Darcy was working with Eugene Grunwald, and there was a project that he was working on. And it was a multi-center project in which all the other centers had results which were different from the results that Eugene Grunwald Center was getting. Now, there was concern amongst all the other centers as to why they were getting results which were different from his center. They tried to talk to him, tried to make him figure out themselves, but they couldn't get down to the bottom of this. They finally asked the funding agency if they would inquire into this and try and find out what was the reason. When they went into a little deeper into this, what they realized was that all the experiments have actually not been done. And John Darcy, who was responsible for doing all the experiments, who had in fact published a number of abstracts, read papers at conferences, and done a huge number of other research, had actually never conducted any of this research. All that he'd done was sit down and fabricated information or falsified information. So that's why Grunwald Center was getting results different from all the other centers, because his guy was not doing any studies at all. So this is an instance of fabrication and falsification. Obviously, if John Darcy got caught out, if you go to PubMed and put in Darcy J, you'll get a huge list of retracted papers. And these papers are retracted all because of this one investigation that happened. Subsequently, obviously, more and more of these papers were detected to be false papers or papers that had false data. David Baltimore, who was Nobel laureate, also was president of the Rockefeller Foundation. He had somebody who was working under him in one of his labs. And that person was accused of some scientific misconduct. While David Baltimore had nothing to do with all that was happening, he had mud on his face. And he, in fact, had to step down from the position of the president of the Rockefeller Foundation. In more recent times, which is still about 30 years ago, there's a paper published. There was a paper which was presented at the American Society of Clinical Oncology meeting, where somebody presented an abstract. There was a single author abstract from a center in South Africa, which suggested that women with breast cancer who had bone metastases could benefit from having bone marrow transplants done. There were 70 odd women that this paper seemed to suggest that being studied with very good results. There was a strong lobby of women with breast cancer in the US. This paper was presented, and very soon after that, this lobby got together and started asking the insurance companies for this particular treatment to be included as a part of the insurance cover. You know, insurance companies were obviously a little unsettled because of this. A, because it was expensive treatment. B, because the data didn't seem to be strong enough. And C, it wasn't very logical either. And so they started to carry out some kind of an inquiry into this. And finally, the Lancet somehow got involved. And all this led to the discovery of the fact that there were a handful of women who had actually had the bone marrow transplants done. The results were far away from what had been predicted. And certainly there were no records at all of the 70 odd women with breast cancer, with bone metastases who'd had these studies, who'd had the bone marrow transplants done. More recently, you would have heard of a Korean scientist who had done some stem cell research, who was accused of fraud, and unfortunately led to him committing suicide because the media carried out a trial, and before, well, the scientific community, of course, did conduct an investigation and find out that there was fraud, but then there was so much hype in the media that he ultimately ended up taking his own life, which was sad. I apologize to those who were in the audience who are anesthetists. So nothing to say that it's anesthetists who do this more or less, but just that these three instances were all from anesthetists. Scott Rubin did a lot of studies on pain medication, but there was an inquiry and it was found that all these studies had never been done. Joachim Bolt, who did a lot of studies on colloid research, and 89 of his 102 studies were considered fraudulent. Yoshitaka Fuji, and the query in front of the 89 suggests that, in fact, even the remaining few studies, there were large questions, but the evidence wasn't strong enough to say that this was fraudulent research. Fuji did a lot of studies on postoperative nausea and vomiting, and 212 of his 249 papers were investigated, and over 150 papers had fabricated data. Now, these are large numbers, and fabricated data, fraudulent research certainly is not acceptable at any point in time. If you end up being caught out with any of this, you might get a retraction in a journal with a clear, your own name written, as well as the title of your paper and the journal, which says very clearly that you've plagiarized material, as was this particular paper plagiarized in the International Journal of Cardiology. Does it happen in India? Do Indian scientists indulge in it? Yes, we are as human as everybody else is on the globe, and there are amongst us people who feel that they would like to achieve more than what they have been able to achieve by whatever research they've done. So in the BMJ, they published a paper, and as a result of investigations that they conducted for almost 8 or 9 years, they ended up coming to the conclusion that there were definitely issues with the results, around the paper that they had published in 1992. And simultaneously, almost simultaneously, the Lancet published something called an expression of concern, titled Indo-Mediterranean Diet Heart Study, an expression of concern. And essentially, again, this related to a paper that had been published in the Lancet, and some of the papers published previously prior to this. They also alluded to the 1992 BMJ paper because it was by the same author from India. Now, obviously, if you go looking for this, you'll find whatever information is available on the net. Unfortunately, I don't put down the person's name because I could be taken to a court of law because of what is it called? Sorry, forget the word. But anyway, you know what it is. So I can't do it. And therefore, I just give you all the references because that gives you the actual information. So why do people do this? There is this thought or belief that if you don't publish, you perish. You work in an academic center. If you don't publish, you don't move up the academic ladder, and therefore you will perish. But if you are one of the 3 anesthesiologists who did those pieces of research, whose papers, it was not 1, 2, 5 papers, it was papers in tens and hundreds, then I wonder whether it's all greed, whether there's actually something wrong with these people who are going ahead and doing these kind of studies. So what are these issues that we're talking about? So obviously we've talked about some of them. I've alluded to some of them. So there's serious scientific misconduct, fabrication, falsification, and plagiarism. We've talked about each one of these as we go along. The second group of issues that we come across are redundant publications. These could be duplicate publications or salami publications. Then there's the issue of conflict of interest, issues around authorship, and finally, a little bit about pseudojournals. So what about scientific misconduct as far as serious scientific misconduct is concerned? So when you fabricate information, you make up data results and record or report them, either while conducting research or while writing up research. As I'm talking about publication ethics, we're looking at writing up research. So introduce non-existent data or information. You could do it at the time of doing the research as well. Falsification is you have data. You started to answer a question, you were looking for a result. Now that result cannot be achieved with the data that you've done. So you've done your studies, you've done your experiments, but now you need to do something to play around, to manipulate the data enough to be able to get the answers that you were looking for. So you manipulate research materials, equipment, processes, or you change or omit data or results so that the research is not accurately represented now. You do it by altering, concealing, or withholding the information. So I have data for 100 patients. I said, let me get rid of the outliers, 10 each on each side. I have then 80 patients, and this gives me the results that I'm looking for. Or let me take out 20 patients, and with these hand-picked 20 patients from within the data, I get the results that I want. Or I pick 5 patients' data or 5 pieces of experiments and alter the information so that this influences the next step in the experiment and therefore gets me the results that I need. So I could do this partly, as I've just explained, or I could do it completely. I've done all the experiments, but now I falsify all my data. I could do it with the data. I could do it with photographs. So there's a subtle difference between fabricating and falsification, but both are equally bad. Then what about plagiarism? Now there are lots of definitions, but essentially what one understands is that one is not allowed to cheat other people's and copy other people's information. So you cannot take another person's ideas, processes, results, or words without giving appropriate credit. So if I didn't do the experiment and I wish to let the world think that I did the experiment, then I will not give credit to the person who's done the experiments. So the American Association of University Professors in 1988 said, taking over the ideas, methods, or written words of another without acknowledgement and with the intention that they may be taken as the work of the deceiver, as defined as this as plagiarism. There was a conference in Singapore in the late 90s, early 20s, which resulted in the Singapore Statement on Research Integrity, essentially saying that there should be honesty in all aspects of research, accountability in the conduct of research, professional courtesy and fairness in working with others. So what it means is that if you've got a student working with you, give the credit to the student where it is due. If you've done all the work, then obviously the credit is yours. But if the student has done all the work, then your credit remains as a teacher, not as the student. So there's a difference. You still get the credit because it was you who guided the student, but it's not you who did the work. So there's a distinct difference, and you need to be sure about this and be clear about this. So professional courtesy and fairness and good stewardship as leaders of research on behalf of others. Those of you who are interested could actually go through a number of these other issues, which the Singapore Statement on Research Integrity talks about. But what it does say is that responsible research publication, the international standards are that you present results clearly, honestly, without fabrication, falsification, or inappropriate data manipulation. adhere to publication requirements, the submitted work is original, is not plagiarized, and has not been published elsewhere. Take collective responsibility for the submitted and published work. And finally, the authorship should reflect the individual's contributions to the work and its reporting. So plagiarism is copying people's words, ideas, and work. It's not uncommon. It does happen. In some fields, it's very common. At some levels, it's very common. Partly, it's because of a lack of awareness. At least people like you who've heard this talk should never ever be able to say or want to say or need to say, I was not aware of what plagiarism is. In some countries, you could lose your job. In India, it's becoming an issue, and more people are who are getting caught out in institutions are having difficulties. They're tending to be reprimanded if the issue is serious enough. They've even lost their jobs. The All India Institute of Medical Sciences in New Delhi has a policy of zero tolerance for scientific misconduct. It has a committee which looks into all allegations of scientific misconduct, seriously examines them, and finally gives a recommendation of what should be done to the concerned authorities. Now, the extent of plagiarism. Now, you could say, I copied a few words. I copied one idea. There were 15 ideas within that paper. I copied one idea. So I'm not that bad. I'm a small thief. I'm not a big thief. So some people have tried to define plagiarism as, the extent of plagiarism from the least severe to the most severe type. And I think what is most important here is no intention to deceive to an intention to deceive. So when you don't have an intention to deceive, you provide the source of the information clearly, but you don't put the information within parentheses, within quotes. What you do is use a very standard method. There's nothing original about it. Hundreds of people have used that method. You copy things that are widely used. It's words and phrases that are used very commonly. You end up using those words and phrases repeatedly to try and because you couldn't find a better phrase to put down what you were feeling at that point in time. And the most severe form obviously is where there's an intention to deceive. You copy whole papers or whole paragraphs. You copy an original phrase, an original idea, you copy all the data, and you don't provide a reference to it. Stephen Schaeffer, who was the editor at one point in time of Anesthesia Analgesia, who along with a lot of other editors, six, if I remember correctly, 6 or 7 of them, worked very hard to pick up these issues of fraud in anesthesia research. And that's how Joachim Bolt, Fuji, and Scott Rubin got caught out. He defined plagiarism in a different manner. He called it technical plagiarism, which was the most simple variety, to intellectual theft, which is deliberate copying of large blocks of text without attribution. Very similar to the worst form in the previous slide. But if you look at the last column, the action was retract the paper right through. So if you have a published paper, it will appear as a retraction in whatever database it would be. And if you've done the worst form, then you could have sanctions imposed on you, and your institution could be informed. So that's his differentiation of different types of plagiarism. Now, people often ask whether you can copy something. Are you allowed to copy something? Excuse me, give me a second. Sorry. So you can, something called copyright laws allow you fair use of a certain amount of text. The limit is 150 words, but you still need to say where you got this information from. So transparency is still important. I can use the information. Nobody will challenge me for using the information, but I still need to tell people that, look, I've used this information from this person. So can I recycle my own text? Which is what the senior author who was asked to write the chapter in the first slide tried to do. He was recycling text. Is there a proportion that I can recycle? Well, actually, there isn't a proportion that you can recycle. More than 120 words, if there is a copyright symbol written on the publication from where you're taking the material, then that's the limit. If it is under the Creative Commons license, you could copy the whole paper because that's what it allows you to do, as long as there isn't a commercial interest, but still requires you to attribute the original work. So how does one prevent plagiarism? So for a lot of you who are students who are doing your, postgrad, postdocs, fellowships, how do you prevent it? When you sit down to write, there is a general tendency to read a paper which is similar to the work that you've done, maybe in a different context, maybe added something to get more information, maybe tweak the previous method to try and get more accurate results, some change. And therefore, when you sit down to write it, you tend to look at those few papers that you referred to while writing up your products. What you need to do is to take effective notes. Read those papers, make your own notes. You want to take, write those notes down on a computer, fine. On an iPad, fine. On a piece of paper, fine. Doesn't matter, anywhere, but make notes. Once you've made those notes, let a few days gap and then sit down to write your own paper. Unfortunately, we often need to submit that paper because we're going up for an interview in 2 weeks' time and you need a publication. Or you need to submit a thesis, which is actually you're an extension and you've got, you've passed half of the extension also. So then it leaves you very little time to do all this. So I suggest that when you read these papers in the course of the research that you're doing, which will happen, you will need to read these papers off and on. At that point in time, take effective notes, mix the citations of those papers in your notes, cite these papers appropriately, and learn to paraphrase the information that you're using from these papers appropriately. Now, you could actually use plagiarism detection software after you've written your paper. Before you submit it to a journal, you've written your thesis before you submit it to your university, and now a lot of universities require you to submit a report which says what is the extent of plagiarism or similarity, not plagiarism, but similarity between published text detected by plagiarism detection software. And if you need to do that, then universities have various guidelines of what the cutoff levels are. But the commonly used ones are Authenticate and Turnitin. These are commercial softwares, but there are free softwares. So you could use Google or Google Scholar. It allows you to string of 120 characters. And then there's Wiper and Crosscheck and a number of other freely available softwares, which all have commercial versions as well. So most of these versions will have a word limit. So they'll say in 7 days, we will allow you to search 3,000 words or 5,000 words. And therefore, if your paper or your thesis is 15,000 words, you will need 2 weeks to be able to do it, because for 7 days, they will give you 5,000 words or 3,000 words for 4 days. And then after 4 days, they'll allow you to do another 4,000 words. So those kind of issues come in the free softwares, but you can use these before you submit your journals for your papers for publication in journals. Now that's the end of the serious misconduct. Now let's look at the more mundane varieties of misconduct. It's not mundane because they don't get you into trouble. It's more mundane because a lot of us are aware of them. Some of us make the effort to try and ensure that we don't end up doing any of these tricks, but some of us deliberately do it in an attempt to bolster our CVs. So duplicate publications and salami publications are two other things that tend to happen. Duplicate publication is when there's substantial overlap, either in the print or in the electronic medium. So it could be an online version and a print version. It could be an online version, or it could be a print and a print version. So I've seen publications with exactly the same information, with the same words, but a different set of authors. 2 or 3 common authors published 3 years apart in the same journal. Now that's not right. So why are editors bothered with these duplicate publications? A, it's waste of resources. Number 2, they're misrepresenting information. But today they're also causing counting problems. People who are doing systematic reviews and meta-analyses are counting these as 2 papers, as 2 sets of data. And that is not correct. And therefore they could end up with results which are incorrect, could end up with a drug being used, a treatment modality being used in our patients with the wrong results. The results would actually have been different if this data had been considered as a single data set rather than 2 data sets. What is permitted? A preliminary report, such as an abstract in a journal, in a conference proceedings, a presentation as a poster, a presentation as at a conference as an oral presentation. So can I do it as a press report? I think that I have information which will kill COVID-19. Should I go and give this to the lay media and tell people that Eureka, this is the Eureka moment, COVID-19 pandemic is now over because I have found the method to kill COVID-19? Well, you can do a press report, but please don't present actual data. Because if you present actual data, then a lot of journals would say we will not publish this because this is already out in the public domain. Now, do duplicate publications occur? So somebody did a study and found that in 2007 in 4 orthopedic journals, there's about 3% of duplicate publications. In 2 plastic surgery journals, it was less than 1%. In ophthalmology publications, is 1%. But in 3 surgical journals, it was 4%. Duplicate submission is something that is just not permitted and is frowned upon very, very strongly because this leads to the use of very scarce good resources, and that's peer reviewers. It could also lead to a duplicate publication. Now, most journals, most authors would say, if a journal accepts my paper, I would withdraw it from the other journal. And therefore, there would be no chance of a duplicate publication happening, even if I've submitted duplicate paper, if the same paper, 2 or 3 or 4 journals. Unfortunately, there are journals today out there who would go ahead and publish your paper because that is going to mean $1,000 for them. And therefore, they're not bothered whether you've given them a reply, you've read the proofs or not. And these are predatory journals or pseudo journals, and we talk about them right at the end. Simultaneous publication is something that can be looked at and is permissible as long as it is transparent and people are informed about it. I don't know how many of you are aware, but for the past 2 years, a large number of journals have been publishing editorials close to the climate conferences, the COP26 and 27, one in Scotland, the second one in Africa, South Africa somewhere, I thought, Johannesburg or Cape Town. And hundreds of journals have brought out editorials talking about the impact of climate change on health and made an appeal to the participants at those conclaves to adhere to some norms so that global temperatures wouldn't rise anymore. But this was all with a clear statement saying that this is a simultaneous publication. The salami publications are multiple publications from a single data set. I do a study over a period of 10 years. I look at, say, 1,000 patients with a particular disease, a disease which is common, say, for example. I then publish the laboratory findings, the pathology findings, the radiology findings, the surgical findings, the follow-up findings, 5 different papers. Now, that's not a great idea. So the other thing that people may do is publish 40 patients studied of a uncommon disorder today. And because they've studied 40 patients and they're published, suddenly the group sees in the next 18 months another 20 patients. So it's a 50% increment. No change in results, but so they say now we must publish another paper because this is now 60 patients. 40 patients took us 40 years, but 60 patients has taken us another 18 months, so we should do this very quickly because this is new information. Well, there's actually no new information. So whenever there is a few patients who overlap, that's fine. But when there's a substantial overlap, that's not acceptable. Is there any instance where you should be allowed to create 2 or 3 publications from a single data set? Well, secondary or simultaneous publication in local versus international publications is permitted. But again, the key is to tell the authors, tell the editors on both sides, and let them take a decision. You as authors cannot go ahead and submit these papers to one, a local journal, and second, an international journal. Both accept the publication, both go ahead and publish it, and it's only then that people realize that you've got a duplicate publication. If you have a large study and using the same data set, you have multidisciplinary conclusions. A typical example would be people who have multi-system disorders, say people with diabetes. So there could be an answer for, or there could be a result which would be important for ophthalmologists. Another result could be important for nephrologists. Another set of results could be important for endocrinologists. Now, I could publish a single paper in a general medical journal, but a general medical journal may turn me down and say, look, I don't think that I'm the right place for you to come to. I am then left with no choice because I need to get to an endocrinologist, a nephrologist, and an ophthalmologist. And they're unlikely to read cross journals. So ophthalmologists are unlikely to read a nephrology journal, and nephrologists are unlikely to read an endocrinology journal. And therefore, it may be justifiable to split that data and provide the ophthalmology conclusions in the ophthalmology journal, the nephrology conclusions in the nephrology journal, and the endocrinology conclusion in the endocrinology journal. But if I do so, I need to be transparent. I need to tell the editors of these 3 journals, submit all 3 papers to all of them and say, the one I wish you to consider is A, the one I wish you to consider is B, and the one I wish you to consider is C. And this is the reason. Provide a justification for doing so. So there are some actual examples in the literature. The BMJ and the New England Journal of Medicine, there was a paper on glucose tolerance, which both journals published. These were not simultaneous publications. There were data from a single study, a large study, different multidisciplinary conclusions drawn, and 2 papers created. Similarly, the American Journal of Cardiology and the New England Journal of Medicine, the work was on syncope. The authors informed the editors. They justified in writing the reasons why they had done this. The editors accepted this and published the justification along with the papers themselves. Now, how do I decide? How do I as an individual decide? Is one paper more informative? If you're not sure, you submit a single paper and inform the editors that this is what you've done. You're not sure that this is the best way to do it, and maybe it's a better choice would be to actually split the paper. Incremental follow-up. I have follow-up of 3 months, I have follow-up for 4.5 months, I have a follow-up for 6 months. If my results haven't changed, then I don't think there's much point in publishing the paper again and again. So here's a gentleman who had not 1, but 2 or 3 retractions in all, because he published the same image not once, twice, but 3 times. And the 3rd time he got into the New England Journal of Medicine when he got caught out, and therefore had mud on his face. Excuse me. So the last important thing that I want to talk about is conflicts of interest. Conflicts exist when there's a divergence between my own interest and my responsibilities to scientific publishing, such that somebody who's observing what is happening, so a reader, might wonder, was Piyush's judgment influenced or motivated by his personal interest? So say I own stocks in a pharma company. I was looking at a molecule that they were doing research on. They came to me and said, do this research. And because I own shares, I thought this was a potentially good molecule to look at. I accepted the offer, created results which were useful for them, went ahead and published it, because I thought that if their drug sells in the market, then the stocks of the company would go, and I, as a shareholder, would benefit. So ties with activities that could inappropriately influence judgment, whether or not it is affected. Now, these could be financial. I've given you an example. They could be personal. So I and another lead researcher in a field could be vying to be number one to end up doing a certain kind of research. And therefore, if that person's paper came to me, I could have a conflict of interest in not seeing that paper get published. And therefore, I would not review the paper in time. Or finally, there could be an academic conflict of interest. And this academic conflict of interest could be for a job, for example. So conflicts of interest could be of authors, of reviewers, as well as of editors. And given you example of all these. Now we finally come to authorship. And authorship means public responsibility to defend a paper for its data and its interpretation, not just the data alone, but its interpretation as well. So the International Committee of Medical Journal Editors currently has these authorship criteria and are accepted globally as the world standard for authorship. Substantial contributions to conception and design, or acquisition of data, or analysis and interpretation of data. And so within serial number 1, you have 1 or 2 or 3, but the 4 all need to be fulfilled. 2, 3, and 4 all need to be fulfilled. And drafting the article or revising it critically for important intellectual content, final approval of the version to be published, and to take responsibility for all errors and omissions too. So authors should end up meeting all these conditions, all 4, but within 1, it could be either one of these 3. These are the current authorship criteria. There's a possibility these might get revised because they've been in existence for a long period of time. Now, there are some people who are ghost authors who write a paper but are not listed as authors. These people usually work for pharmaceutical companies. They would write, so industry sponsored papers, they would write a paper which would put a spin on the effectiveness of a drug in a particular condition. Now, the problem here is incorrect credit and attributing the work to a name. And if they attribute the work to a big shot's name, a person who's very highly regarded, then that person is writing a review article or suggesting that this drug has useful utility in a particular scenario, could influence a large number of users of that drug to use the drug in a particular set of patients. Gift authors are people who do no work. And the typical gift authors in the Indian scenario are the Gabbar Singhs of Indian medicine, and they are the heads of departments. They're becoming better slowly and slowly. Since I've been calling them Gabbar Singhs for the past 2 decades, they've slowly decided that they should. I used to call them Gabbar Singhs even before I became a head of department. I call them even now on the verge of retirement. I retire at the end of this year. So people who do no work and then name you, or they name you because they need to oblige you. And sometimes they name you because they think that the editor knows so-and-so. So editor knows Dr. Amita Agarwal, knows Dr. Vinita Agarwal, the editor knows Dr. Piyush Sahni. Put their name on, more likely the paper will get accepted. We're all humans, no? Editors are also humans. Again, the problem is incorrect credit. And if fraud were to occur, the gift authors would say, I have had nothing to do with this paper. Somebody put my name. Okay. So you need to be careful about it. The final few slides on pseudo journals. What are these? These are journals which used to be called predatory journals. They're today called pseudo journals more commonly and more accurately. They publish almost all that they receive. They often charge you, well, a lot of good journals also charge you today a publication charge. These are the so-called open access journals, but they inform you about the payment upfront. So some of these journals have also started informing you about payments upfront. But most importantly, they don't peer review. So any scientific journal worth its salt will ensure that an article that it publishes goes through a proper process of peer review. Now, peer review takes time and effort and some money. Money is not too much, but time and effort, both. And a lot of these journals want to publish in a week's time, in 5 days' time, in 3 days' time, in 2 days' time. So when you get an invitation and they say, submit a paper to us for the next issue of the journal, which is coming out in 7 days' time, obviously you don't have anything ready with you and you decide that you're going to not publish, that's fine. But if you have something ready with you and get tempted, submit it to them, they'll actually publish it in 48 hours after they've got their 20,000 rupees. Unfortunately, there are some who take money and not publish, they'll just disappear from the scene. They become fewer and fewer. Now, how do I, as a young novice in the field of scientific research and publishing, figure out which journal is a predatory or a pseudo journal and which journal is a genuine journal? Go to your mentor, go to your teacher, ask them. They'll be able to tell you, they'll be able to guide you. But in case they do not, in case they're very busy, which they often are, sometimes they put on the act of being very busy, like I do often when I don't want to do these difficult things about trying to explain things to people. When I'm tired, I should be honest and tell them that, but sometimes I'm dishonest. Shouldn't be. Anyway, go to this website called www.think-check-submit and go and look up this site. It tells you to think, it tells you to check a few things, and only if your answer is a yes to all the questions, then should you go ahead and submit to that particular journal. So in summary, what I've done is covered plagiarism, its different types and prevention. Talk to you a little bit about redundant publication. Given you a sniff of what conflicts of interest are. Told you something about authorship, gift authors and ghost authors, and very little about pseudojournals. For those of you who are interested, you could actually read a book which has been edited by me and Professor Rakesh Agarwal on publishing in the health sciences. It's available for 300 rupees if you send 300 rupees to the National Medical Journal of India. I get no cut out of it. Thank you very much. If you have any questions, I'm happy to answer them. And no difficulty in finding a replacement for me. No worries. Thank you.